this dam apparently is just 30 kilometers from Arunachal Pradesh, and any kind of a man-made disaster or a climate trigger, could in fact be a crisis multiplier threatening the towns and the cities. So, in terms of really looking at the lower riparian areas of Arunachal Pradesh, and one needs to really look at that, because you are in fact really tampering with the health of the river. And so, Tibet is really the key strategic node, I would say, in creating a transformational power. And this transformational power is diplomatic, it's economic, it's military, very very significant. So it definitely has a connotation first in terms of the domestic consolidation. It really feeds into the economic aspects, the economic needs of China, but at the same time really helps to in fact establish its control there in Tibet, and at the same time really facilitate, once you actually establish that as a base, you in fact also facilitate the kind of engagements you can have with the neighboring regions. They
Greetings, listeners, and welcome to our fifth episode of Understanding Asian Hydropolitics through five questions, presented by Asian Confluence. And I'm your host, Neeraj. And I'm eager to dive into a topic that's shaping the future of water security and geopolitics in Asia. Today, we are dealing into China's proposed dam at Medog County and its implications for transboundary water security. As always, we'll unpack this issue through five carefully crafted questions designed to spark insight and dialogue. So today we are joined by Dr. Medha Bisht, who is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations, South Asia University, New Delhi. Dr. Bisht is a distinguished scholar whose work on South Asia hydropolitics, strategic studies, and the Brahmaputra River offer critical, gives insightful perspective on water governance and regional dynamics. Dr. Bisht, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Dr. Manhas. It's a pleasure again. It's always good to go back to Asian Confluence, which I believe truly in literal terms is a confluence of ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Mira. So, just to set the stage, we are the ongoing discussion about the proposed dam at Medong County has sparked a very significant concern across South Asia. So, could you walk us through the key features of this dam, why it has raised concern in India and other lower riparian states? Over to
Yes.
you.
Yeah. Sure. So I think, before analyzing any physical infrastructure, and here it's the water infrastructure, the large dam, it's important to go through the essential parameters. And I think no better way in terms of at least what the official reports from China have to say about it. So, in terms of really looking at the features first, and talking about the height of the dam, the dam is almost over 2,000 meters, which in fact makes it a large dam. The Chinese call it a super dam, in fact. The dam, of course, has massive energy generating potential, and with some estimates saying that it would generate 70 million kilowatts of exploitable energy. Now, in terms of the cost, if you see, its estimated cost is supposed to exceed around 137 billion US dollars. So far, it's one of the most expensive water infrastructure projects in China. In terms of its location, we see that it's definitely everyone knows that it's on the lower stretches of Yalung Tsangpo River in Tibet. The idea seeded way back, I would say, in as early as late 2000s, and since then we were hearing whispers that there could be a dam which could come up. There were certain dams which were already coming in, like the Sangmo Dam, but the Chinese had always sort of shut it aside in terms of saying, these are run of the river dams and they do not really have any potential harm, particularly for the downstream. But we do really see this idea in terms of now seeing its strategic chronology. I think way back from I would go to 90s also, when this whole idea was being conceptualized. Now we, in fact, really see it being translated into reality. So it's on the lower stretches of the Yarlung Zangpo, which makes it therefore so critical, at least for the downstream countries. And if you look at the design of the dam, now the design of the dam is pretty interesting because it also helps you to look at and understand the typical Chinese approach when they're doing hydropower investments, particularly in other countries also. So, what the Chinese reports say that the dam adopts a development method of interception and tunnel diversion to five cascade power stations. Now, I think we need to unpack this. What does it really mean? What kind of implications does it have? So it basically means there are going to be multiple cascade dams which can store and regulate water. Storage here is supposed to be understood in hour and days. Technically, this is, as the Chinese say, a run on the river project. Therefore, it will have minimal water retention capacity. But at the same time, you can, in fact, really play out with the timing and the control of the dam flows. Now, the five cascade dam the dams, in particular, means that it is a distributive peak flow which reduces peak flood pressure on any single structure. Also, when it really talks about the tunnel diversion advantages, it really implies that it will maintain river flows during the construction and emergencies and can also enable rapid drawdown of reservoir levels when needed. Now, I think these facts are important, in terms of understanding the Chinese narrative. And finally, the third point, it talks about interception capabilities. And what do interception capabilities mean? It means that yes, it could control sediment transport and the debris flow. For instance, the kind of dams that they've been investing in Nepal, in particular, where the kind of model dam frame, which is really coming out in the public domain, that these are sustainable hydropower projects. So you're seeing that sort of a narrative in terms of now framing, dams as being sustainably more good. And it also talks about that there will be multiple interception points along the river system. So, as I said, now if you really look at the Chinese narrative here, the Chinese facts are based on a development narrative, and they have also continuously been saying that the water resource interests of the lower riparian or the downstream communities or countries will not be hampered because we've taken due consideration of all these. So these were, I think, the larger aspects which are associated with it. But definitely, and the features, as you asked me. But now, really coming to the concerns, they are, of course, broad concerns and they are very specific concerns. So the broad concerns, and these are, of course, hypothetical scenarios out there. Imagine a scenario where there are extreme weather events which go beyond the dam parameters or the design parameters. Then what really happens? It can cause failure, and how do you really deal with that? The second hypothetical scenario, I would say, and we all know that the Himalayan rivers are heavy sediment load rivers. So dredging has to be done continuously. In terms of the water flow, you have to regulate the rhythm and the health of the river. Of course, it's in a seismic zone, a seismic sensitive zone. What happens when landslides happen? And of course, when you are in fact really dealing with the physical infrastructure, these issues become very, very important. And how do you in fact really deal with some of these unseen calamities? Um, Again, if one cascade dam fails, then it will in fact really lead to increased pressure on other dams. So these are some hypothetical scenarios, and of course, these uncertainties will be there because the information is not really as transparent as we assume to be. We are getting what we are reading, in the Chinese official media. So more specifically and more diplomatically or strategically, I would say, what kind of specific concerns it raises. The first thing, and I think a very important thing, is that it raises uncertainty amongst the downstream states. So when we are talking about uncertainty, I think if a policymaker is working in an uncertain environment, that really raises stakes because the whole idea of diplomacy negotiations is to, in fact, have some element of certainty. You minimize uncertainty through negotiations. So increasing uncertainty amongst the downstream states means that they'll be continuously on tenterhooks, and the kind of debates and the narratives that we are seeing here will only become powerful over a period of time. Second, the lack of information on dams is not available. How do we really assess the impact of these dams? Because they will be very, very important in terms of really looking at the nature of preparedness that we have as downstream countries. Um, and this is very important because I think when you again look at the Himalayan rivers, rather than mitigation, the Chinese are also calling it as a renewable energy project, which will help them meet the carbon neutrality targets. So, as a green energy project, this dam is really being projected on that front. So, I think, but more than that, mitigation is fine. We also need adaptation, resilience. More information is needed. Another specific issue that I would like to raise here in terms of the concerns which are there, there is no legally binding MOU. MOUs are there, but these are soft laws through which China, in fact, really operates its water diplomacy on. And a Galwan like incident or a Doklam like incident happens, and then you don't really get the flood data. So the thing is that are there any legally binding instruments? Are there? Definitely not, because China primarily works under the framework of soft law. And of course, coming from Tibet, and there are of course a lot of ecological and human rights concerns which are being raised. There is no real assessment of how of what kind of impact the dam is having at the societal level, and particularly at the ecological level when we want to look at the local ecosystem. And of course, culture is also an issue there, because I think the way we really look at the kind of population, the people who are inhabiting this region, they have a deep relation, with water. And the kind of belongingness they really have in terms of looking at water issues is very, very relational in nature, rather than very rational or dualistic. So I think with these cultural, social, ecological, economic issues, and having no idea, because they are still, I said, there are hypothetical scenarios out there. You're also seeing sort of confusing voices coming out from the public domain that, well, the dam would not really be a problem. We really need to see. Maybe it's good for India. But yes, again, one of the major concerns, and that one really needs to think of when we're looking at the Himalayan rivers. If a dam race is really going to happen, which eventually would, a reaction would in fact really have a counter reaction. And while at least in India, the dam debate is in fact really filtered a bit, and there is a lot of noise, primarily from the environmental lenses. Now we really see this whole issue getting securitized to a certain extent. So I think one really needs to look at this dam and development debate in a specific perspective, and more so, and I think this is very, very critical. This debate is really happening when there is a larger debate which is going at the international level on the decommissioning of large dams. I mean, America has decommissioned some of its dams. China, on its own, has decommissioned some of its own domestic dams out there. And here we are talking about large dams. So I think way back in 2000, when the World Commission on Dams report came, and there was a proper holistic assessment done on the social, ecological, cultural aspects, I think we need to revisit those debates and really think that dams really helpful, or would they be leading us to a strategic stalemate in near future, particularly when it comes to dealing with a northern neighbor, China, in that context.
So, Dr. Mida, that's really a clear and concerning picture, and it's very evident that this dam could have a very, very far-reaching implication. So now, let us now try to explore that what this means for the regional downstream. So
Yeah.
now I'm going to talk about, the we have talked about that its larger implication in South Asia, why other countries are also concerned. But the dam location on the Yarlang Sanko, which becomes the Brahmaputra in India and then Jamuna in Bangladesh. Now this places it at a very critical juncture. So how might this project affect the hydrological flow when we are talking about the downstream countries, specifically particularly focusing in India, where Arunachal Pradesh and Assam are being affected by this.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Dr. Neeraj, because here is where we are getting science in conversation with politics. Now, what we are really dealing with here, of course, we're dealing with a country, China, which of course has its own strategic culture, but we are also dealing with something which we need to first understand, and that is nature. Right. And there is where I think questions like hydrology, questions like the ecosystem become very, very important. It's a river system. There is a water system, there is an energy system, there is a food system out there. And these upstream and downstream linkages are important, because any physical change, or if the physical environment really changes in the upstream area, which could be the land use, which could be the physical infrastructure, which could be the soil erosion, it can have an impact on the downstream water availability. So I would say that, to be more specific in terms of the impact it could really have on the downstream, is of course the nature of earthquakes, and the landslides, which are going to impact these downstream areas, because this dam apparently is just 30 kilometers from Arunachal Pradesh. And any kind of a man-made disaster or a climate trigger, could in fact be a crisis multiplier, threatening the towns and the cities. So in terms of really looking at the lower riparian areas of Arunachal Pradesh, and one needs to really look at that, because you are in fact really tampering with the health of the river. So this is one. Second, I would say that while China says it's the run of the river dam, as I've already pointed out, it's just going to disrupt the natural rhythm, of the Brahmaputra. Many livelihoods really depend on it. And of course, with the dams, we all know there could be flow fluctuations, which might not just sink in with the interests and the demand of the downstream countries. Uh, so how would all of this in fact really impact, the entire region becomes very important. Also, we know that when we look at dams, dams are in fact a site of resistance, disasters, and political tensions. So and as I was really talking about the dam race, the kind of responses we will have from Assam also become important, because this is a very water aware region.
Okay, so that really underscores the stakes for downstream communities and their ecosystem. So it's a very complex challenge with local and regional dimension. So now let us zoom out and examine China's broader approach in this. As we know that the Medong County Dam isn't just an isolated project; it's a part of China's broader engagement with the transboundary. So how do you assess China's approach to transboundary rivers in South Asia? And do you see this dam as a part of larger hydro strategic push?
The thing is that if you really look at Chinese strategy, they always have a long term view. And definitely, water is one aspect through which you can, in fact, exercise your leverage. But it's in fact really built into the larger strategic thinking of China there in Tibet, right? So I would say that if one really looks at the larger strategic posturing, first of all, I would say rather than just giving it a very external connotation, it has a internal connotation in terms of really looking at the domestic politics of China in particular. So the first is, of course, control over Tibet. That is one. That's one of the primary internal objectives which China has had. Tibet is really the key strategic node, I would say, in creating a transformational power. And this transformational power is diplomatic, it's economic, it's military, very, very significant. So it definitely has a connotation first in terms of the domestic consolidation. It really feeds into the economic aspects, the economic needs of China, but at the same time really helps to in fact establish its control there in Tibet, and at the same time really facilitate, once you actually establish that as a base, you in fact also facilitate the kind of engagements you can have with the neighboring regions. So they can be developmental, yes, that's what China says, but then we do really see that it is a double-edged sword there. It also has military connotations, right? And I think that is very, very important to understand. The second strategic objective is, of course, external. and external is where China really gets that space in terms of influencing the water discourse in South Asia, in terms of really looking at the riparian dynamics in South Asia. I mean, for instance, really look at the kind of work that China has done in Bangladesh in terms of assuaging its own fears as a downstream country. I mean, there are also conflicting noises, voices which are coming in there, and they're saying that, okay, maybe the dam is not really bad, right? That's one. The second is that I think you really asked me about the larger patterns. And if you really look at the larger patterns, hydropower is one of the sectors where China has huge investments in. And it is, in fact, not only in South Asia, but in Africa also. It has huge investments in the hydropower sector. And and of course, one of the ways it's really doing it, we know it was definitely linked to the BRI project. China, a dam, the maintenance of the Tista barrage, which was given to in India first, now has gone to China. So it's in terms of its engagement on water related projects, it's very much there. But even in the context of Nepal, if you see, that's very, very phenomenal, because some of the projects were given to China. China weaned from some of the projects on its own, saying that they're not feasible. But on some of the projects, India had put a condition that if the hydroelectricity is actually produced from Chinese funded projects, we will not buy it. And therefore, some of those projects then came to India. But surprisingly, if you really look at now how China has in fact really, and what China is really doing in the hydro sector there, is that it's really, in fact, trying to build in this, or build up or nurture or cultivate this idea of sustainable hydropower. uh, and particularly in one of the projects, which is called the Manang Marchiali hydroelectric project, which has been considered as one of the flagship projects between India, between China and Nepal, where they are saying that it is in fact really promoting sustainable hydropower. And one of the ways through which they have done it is that on one particular, this is also a run on the river project. It's a cascade kind of an approach, where you are building multiple cascade dams, and you are in fact really providing channels there, so that at least the large debris flow can be contained, but yet at the same time the small debris can be passed through. And meanwhile, it also gives you that space to rechannelize the flow of the river. So I think that is one way through which China is very, very active. Another thing is that, and again, it's not really focusing on treaties, but these are soft law approaches. We will give you flood data, so there are opening communication channels. There is some kind of a soft engagement with these neighbors. Yeah, in terms of sharing research also on technology, etc. So I think again, based on non-binding MOUs, it's in fact really making its impact being felt in South Asia. But again, being upper riparian, because it really controls the headwaters there, it very much does have an influence in shaping the riparian hydropolitics.
So, Dr. Medha, that's really a very compelling perspective, and it's clear that water is a strategic tool in China's regional playbook, and this raises a question about how India can also respond this very effectively. So, given this potential risk of China's upstream interventions, India faces both diplomatic and institutional challenges. So, in your view, how India is prepared both institutionally and diplomatically to address these kind of a risk of unilateral upstream interventions by China?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question, because now I think the elephant is right there. This is the big elephant in the room. What can India do? And when you, in fact, and India has had a muted response so far. We're saying that we need information. There has to be, and we are monitoring these developments very, very closely. But get to think of it, and let's be realistic. I mean, in terms of looking at the Grand Renaissance project, uh, just taking some examples from there, Egypt always has claimed water rights on River Nile, but Ethiopia did go up went ahead, and it was more of a fait accompli. The downstream cannot do much except for, of course, diplomatically positioning itself. You can say that, well, you can build coalitions, etc. um, you in fact can have a legal argument, like for instance, Egypt also has. It's not much, okay, except for, in fact, I think what India really needs to do is to build a narrative now, a powerful narrative, because narrative does have power. And I think India is not very good in terms of building the narrative. I mean, you look at the narrative around the super dam, the dam which we are really talking about here, in the Medog County, the kind of narrative which China has built in, it has in fact really pitched in, synced this debate, with the global discourse in terms of renewable energy, in terms of carbon neutrality, in terms of the no harm principle to the downstream states, in terms of reasonable utilization. So if you really look at some of these aspects, they in fact really talk to the international community, particularly the kind of debates, the climate discourses that we are really seeing in. So I think what India really needs to do, more specifically, but we have to think through, what India really needs to do. It needs to, in fact, really hold this ground that information needs to be transparent. Adaptation preparedness, you asked me. Adaptation preparedness is not very good, because if and I've always been a supporter of adaptive water diplomacy, because disasters can be a gateway to water diplomacy in South Asia. But how do you really adapt in terms of what are the structural and the non-structural measures that you can have in terms of thinking of a scenario where there's a potential flood scenario? I think these are the things that we really need to talk at the domestic level, rather than be caught in some of these debates which are happening. Because as I said, the Egypt Ethiopia example is in fact a good reminder of the fact that you cannot do anything if the upstream really decides to make it. And what China is doing, in fact, China is really pitching it in a very intelligible manner, syncing it with some of the global norms. Another thing which I think which one could really look at, and this again comes from South Asia, the kind of energies, the kind of work which has been put in terms of developing early warning mechanisms on these border rivers by a lot of social organizations, a lot of NGOs, a lot of informal collectives, and these formal organizations really coming together. And it's high time that we, in fact, really institutionalize some of these collectives which are distributed, across borders or across border districts along the river. The second thing I would say is that, of course, when we know that while there are water treaties, there are issues of implementation out there, and I think there has to be a corrective measure in terms of looking at these treaties. There have to be relational ways, which I keep on talking about, in terms of looking at water. And this primarily goes back to your second question, which you were asking about the upstream and the downstream impact which we have. So, what could be the corrective measures? As I said, we do have the social capital out here. The community preparedness is associated with that. The adaptive diplomacy, the nature of adaptive diplomacy is associated with that. So I think we need to sort of rethink, rework our bilateral agreements in a holistic manner, primarily because of climate change being one of them. If dams are being built, I'm not against dams. But if dams are being built, they have to be monitored regularly. The dredging has to be really taken care of. The E&M, the aspects, the evaluation, the monitoring aspects need to be looked at. So I think revisit the treaties and think that, how you can in fact really bridge some of these micro concerns which the people have, and some of these broad meta concerns which the countries have. And I think this is the time to really pitch in that narrative, and that will really help in terms of drawing issues of the international community and also of the South Asian community, the real issues which are there, which actually come from uncertainty, which could in fact really lead to trust deficit and then spill over in terms of drifting the two countries or the larger strategic discourse on a much more volatile zone. So I think, yeah, a couple many issues are there, but I think the this becomes sort of significant when we are looking at some of these aspects that you asked about.
Okay, so that's a very sobering assessment, but it also highlights opportunities for India to strengthen its approach. Now coming to my last question, which mostly on confidence building measure. So in the transboundary river governance, it we have seen that it requires a lot of trust and collaboration, which can be very hard to achieve in a region with a very competitive interest. So, what is in your view? What kind of a confidence building measures or the regional frameworks, I would say, would you suggest to improve this kind of a transparency or the cooperation between all the transboundary river governance, whether it's between India or China or across the South Asian countries?
Yeah. So I think, like maybe I sort of alluded to this in the previous question, because when you're really talking about confidence building, first you need to see what are going to be the basic principles, what are going to be the substantive and the procedural aspects around which you can, in fact, build that kind of a confidence. I mean, get to think of it. We are nearing an end in terms of looking at the Ganges Water Treaty. We had, in fact, really talked about basin management. And till now, I mean, we are way to go. I mean, in terms in that direction, right? So, water, and I'll start with this caveat that water is a non-starter when it comes to cooperation in South Asia. Unfortunately, it's more of a sovereign object, right? And therefore, if you, but at the same time, to say that water is a non-starter in terms of looking at cooperative diplomacy, it's not to say that nothing can happen. And I think the first thing which is needed is that rather than like getting into negotiation frameworks right at the outset, it's very important to have that dialogic space which can in fact really build and look at some of the enabling conditions which can help in furthering water diplomacy. Again, how do you in fact really do that in terms of, and that cannot just happen at the level of state to state level diplomacy. You really need to in fact really bring in the people. You really need to really talk about some of the community the work that the communities have done. And because the people are, those concerns are of the people, there are really structures out there which have been built through the efforts of, as I said, various civil society organizations, formal and informal. They need to build on, because I think, that could be one of the ways in terms of really looking at the border rivers rather than making it a conversation between Dhaka and New Delhi and Islamabad. That could in fact go a wrong way. The thing is that that is one. The second thing, and I would say that this is important, we have a joint rivers commission in Bangladesh, for instance. Now, people have been also like looking at the Tista Water Treaty, for instance. Many say that, we were actually close to a deal, but it didn't really happen. But one of the reasons as to why the Ganges Water Treaty also happened was because, there was some data out there on the ground on which you could discuss. So I think there need to be joint hydrological surveys if we are serious about our rivers. Another important aspect, and this is also very important. So when we are talking about transboundary water cooperation, as I said, and if you are talking about a confidence building measure, for instance, like this whole ecosystems for life project, which really came in, or the dolphin diplomacy, which probably was in fact practiced by certain civil society organizations, where, the whole idea of dolphin is not just a fish species, but then the presence of the dolphin actually makes the river healthy. So, well, you do not want to talk about the river, but you can talk about the species which benefit the river system, and that can become a platform for opening channels of communication between countries. So I would say there are ideas there in South Asia. There have been talks, there have been communications which has happened. If not at the state level, definitely at the sub-national level and the transboundary scales at the local level, this kind of cooperation is very, very fertile and it's very, very active. But how do you, in fact, really make it really speak with the kind of formal structures which we have, with the kind of local governments which we have, become very, very important. So I think one needs a much more holistic approach, again, in terms of talking about confidence building. Because, again, one of my basic propositions, and I've written on this, is that, if you really start with negotiations, it's not going to go anywhere. You need to have dialogue, so have a more dialogic space, and there can be different ways of increasing this dialogic space, because we have South Asian countries do have so much in common. In fact, I keep on saying that South Asia lives on its borders. But if we securitize these borders, and we know that the kind of issues that we are really happening also, I mean, forget about a multilateral, multi-level approach. It will never functionalize. It will never operationalize, because obviously there's no space for that kind of a debate. So I think getting the people in, getting the fauna in, getting the flora in, and that kind of a much more broader understanding can be a way forward in terms of building confidence. And at the same time, it's more strategic also in terms of building the narrative power. So yes, I think these are some of the points which come to my mind right now.
Okay, so Dr. Medha, those ideas and really, it really points to a path forward. And because building trust and cooperation is no small task, but it is very much essential for the region's future. So thank you so much for this illuminating conversation. And because your insights, it has really given us a lot to think about, from a ecological risk to the potential of regional cooperation. Thank you so much for your time. And to our listeners, we hope this episode has also deepened your understanding on Asia's water challenges. So just stay with us for more thought provoking discussions in the upcoming podcast. Thank you so much.